time if that's okay. But good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session, Operating Under COVID Restrictions. So this is the first in the Leisure Network's four-part club development series that we'll be running over the next couple of weeks. My name's Brooke Connolly from Leisure Networks, and I'll be your host for this evening's session. Just a quick reminder to pop your microphone on mute and to turn your camera off just while we're doing the presentation, just so to make sure that we get the best quality and vision for everyone. That'd be great. We will use the chat function for interactions and questions tonight. If you're not familiar with it, on your computer and your tablet, you find a little chat bubble on the toolbar. If you're on a phone, the chat function's in the top right-hand corner. You're right to choose your level of participation into the session tonight. You can use that chat function, or we're really happy to follow up with you at a later date, whatever's more comfortable and suits you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, acknowledging that we all are meeting on different places in various parts of the state. I'm in Geelong, home of the Wadawurrung people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to any emerging leaders we might have joining us for this evening's session. As I said, tonight is the first of a four-part series for clubs and associations from across the Barwon region. I'd like to welcome you all and welcome the State Sporting Association representatives we've got online tonight as well. This series has been developed in response to 500 plus conversations held across regional Victoria since March, where we asked clubs what were the biggest concerns for clubs and their membership during the COVID-19 impacts. The four sessions that we've put together tonight are a direct response to the biggest concerns and queries that we've had from clubs. So tonight we'll present information relating to clubs operating under COVID restrictions. Just note this is high level information and it should be overlaid in conjunction with your peak body, so your national sporting organisation, your state sporting association and your local government or authority. I'd now like to introduce our presenter for tonight, Jessie Drever from Leisure Networks. Jessie's got a strong passion for community sport and has professional and voluntary roles with several organisations across the Barwon region. With a background in law, Jessie will lead you through some considerations when your club is returning to train and to play. Myself and Tim Downs, our colleague, will moderate the chat function and we'd really love you to use that chat function if you feel comfortable. So I'll now hand over to you, Jessie.
Thanks, Brooke, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first session in our club development series. To start things off tonight, and we've done it with a few sessions we've conducted lately, it's just a bit of fun and a bit of a way to have a bit of an icebreaker exercise to start with. It's also a good way to get used to the chat function. So what we want to do, we want to know the answers to some of the unanswered questions in life. So these are the questions that always float around the tea rooms, the water coolers, the social media platforms, and we want to see if we can get the definitive results through our little session tonight. So if you could each write your responses in the chat function, we'll see what each of you think of the following. So first up, it's a fairly regional based question, this one, in terms of we see different answers in different regions, but we'll see how we go with this first one. Palmy or Palmer? Is it the Palmy or the Palmer? I'm seeing a bit of a mix here. Next one on the list, some famous Aussie athletes here. Kathy Freeman or Susie O'Neill? So on the athletics track or in the pool? Kathy or Susie? Kathy fairly dominant in this one, I think, so far. Coming out of winter, we're into the bit of the warmer weather, but what did we don during the winter period? Were they the slippers or Ugg boots? What do we think? Slippers or Ugg boots? Bare feet. Crocs, there we go. There's a couple of different ones coming up. A few neithers as well. Interesting. All right, he bowed out on the weekend, the younger one, and I know we've got a few Tigers supporters in the room, but we'll see how we go with this one. We are in the Barwon region, so hopefully we've got a few Cat supporters as well. So Gary Ablett Jr. or Gary Ablett Senior? Junior or senior? Both, Brooke Connolly. All right, two to go. A food one. We're coming at dinner time now, so pretty simple here. Pizza or pasta? If we're going to the Italian restaurant, are we going pizza or pasta? Down at Town and Country or La Porchetta? Pizza or pasta? Nice mix of both. And the last one on the list, when the nightclubs or the pubs open back up again, are we going to Lammy's or the Max? I don't know if it's still called the Max, but it's been the Max for years. Is it Lammy's or the Max? Where are we going? Barwon Club, Jack Stevens. Good supporter of South Barwon. Bowls Clubs, good options come up here actually. Ocean Grove Hotel, interesting. All right, very good. Thanks everyone for giving some of those answers. Just again, as we said, just a bit of an icebreaker and a good way to introduce you to the chat function. But we'll kick off with our content for the night. So starting off, looking at the current situation, obviously as a starting point, it's been pretty obvious that the COVID crisis has had extremely significant consequences on society in general, but as you all would have experienced in one way or another, there's been obviously a huge impact on sport through this period as well. So obviously with the current restrictions in place, organised sport has been effectively ground to a halt for a majority of this year. And this has a huge impact on a variety of stakeholders in sport. So that the clubs, associations, state bodies, councils, and of course, participants themselves. But hopefully there's some light on the horizon with the recent changes that have come into effect and those that have been forecasted, which we'll touch on shortly. From a governance and a club support perspective, state and national sport organisations have seen a substantial hit to their workforce, either through redundancies or stand down. So some examples of this, the AFL quite publicly that they had to cut their workforce by 20% after nearly 6 months of stand downs. And Netball Victoria, Cricket Victoria and Basketball Victoria, as well as a lot of others, have also had stand downs, redundancies or reduced workloads through this period. What impact does this have for local clubs and associations? It depends a little on the sport, but regardless, there is going to be more importance placed on councils and RSAs, so regional sport bodies such as leisure networks for capacity building and on-the-ground support for clubs and associations. There's no doubt that the economic impact of this crisis is going to be seen in sport for years to come. But in saying that, the importance of sports clubs in providing ways for communities to connect is probably actually enhanced through this period. And those that are able to be innovative and be able to adapt to keep their members engaged are going to see opportunities coming out the other side when we do get back to sport. What I want to do, and hopefully you got the bandwidth to view this video, or at least listen to the message that's coming across. I wanted to share a video that the AIS put together earlier this year. It involves a number of national level athletes talking about the return to sport post-COVID. And there'll be a few messages that you'll pick up from this that we'll touch on through our presentation as well.
As athletes, we all need to understand that it will take time to return to a normal routine. So be patient and make the most of this break.
I'm really missing my weekend sport, but I do understand that getting back into sport, we have to do it safely.
Make sure you follow the guidelines on when to return from your state or territory authorities.
As you prepare to get back to sport, think about some of the things you might need to get used to.
Whether it may be new hygiene practices or keeping safe distances from others.
When we do get back, it might not look the same as it did before, but it's really important to adapt and be flexible in our return to sport to make sure everybody is doing so in the safest way possible.
Upon returning to our sports, we'll all be excited to see our teammates and our coaches again.
But I think we really need to take the approach of get in, train and get out and just avoid any unnecessary contact.
Sanitise your hands before going to training and after training. Try and be as clean as possible on the way in and the way out.
Continue to check in with your training partners, teammates and coaches, and never be afraid to reach out and ask for help.
So we can speed up the return to sport.
I encourage everyone to download the COVID Safe app
to help authorities find and contain any outbreaks while keeping Australia safe.
Download the COVID Safe and remember to follow the sport-specific health guidelines so that I can get out of this pool, back on the river, and so that we can all get back out as a community and play sport again.
So as I said, the video itself touches on a few different tips for individuals, clubs and associations that we're going to go into a bit more detail with now. Firstly, as you'll all undoubtedly be aware, and as we've touched on, the state government are imposing all restrictions on movement and social distancing. So I have a slide on the latest from yesterday's announcements that we'll go through shortly, but just generally in terms of any return to play or training plans, everything is obviously going to be contingent upon these government restrictions. This is at both a professional and a community level. And we've seen a number of sports are actually moving to put in place contingency plans to return to train and play depending upon different possibilities that could come to play over the coming weeks and months. So an example of this, Cricket Australia and Cricket Victoria have been pretty proactive in preparing resources and holding webinars for their member clubs in anticipation of the upcoming season. And they've communicated that there are a number of options on the table, obviously. So whether that is a reduced season in terms of number of games, changes to types of games, no more 2 days that have been typically in the past, and sliding back the season a bit to allow for longer lead time in terms of training. So we're starting to get a bit more certainty as to where we're looking in terms of the summer sports, but they have been fairly proactive through the winter months and in the last few months, especially in terms of having these discussions and making clubs aware of what the possibilities might be. And we're hopeful that, and we've seen definitely that a lot of the other state sport bodies are in the same boat in terms of being on the front foot and communicating what the seasons might look like coming forwards. We've also noted on this slide that clubs should consider seeking independent legal and financial advice when finalising plans to return to sport. And this is because, look, although clubs have faced similar difficulties due to the current crisis, each will have their own circumstances that apply in relation to the impacts and the responsibilities. So it might be prudent for clubs to get some clarity from a legal and financial perspective that they aren't breaching any obligations and that they have the financial viability to carry out the plans that they've got in place. On the screen at the moment, this is a summary table that the government have put out for the latest easing of restrictions in regional Victoria from 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, 27th of October, so tomorrow. The changes from previous releases are marked in purple, but in summary, non-contact indoor physical recreation for those 18 and under can resume to a maximum of 20 people. They have stated expressly that the non-contact means that the activity can be done with a restriction of 1.5 metres. And they've also noted that spectators are limited to one parent, guardian or carer only. Also, non-contact indoor community sport for those 18 and under can resume. Indoor non-contact fitness, such as gyms, can also resume, but they've got some very strict measures in place that are available, that are on the website, the government website. Outdoor contact and non-contact sport is allowed for those 18 and under, but it is limited to the minimum number of people to play and facilitate the activity. So the players themselves, the coaches and the officials. Outdoor non-contact sport is allowed for adults, but this is again limited to the minimum number of people to play and facilitate the activity. And again, it is expressly stated that participants must be able to maintain distance of 1.5 metres. There are a number of other changes coming in for recreation generally, which you can see on the slide, but we've just touched on the ones that are obviously going to be relevant to community sport. And again, I'll say it, I've said it a couple of times and I'll say it a number of times further throughout the presentation, but rely on what's coming from your governing body in terms of what category your sport fits into, whether it's non-contact or contact, and what variations they're allowed to put in place to actually allow for competition to resume if possible. An example of this one, as I've mentioned cricket as Victoria already, but this is what they put out at the start of last week, and they will do the same again. We're assuming with the latest restrictions they're going to come in, but this is effectively their guidelines as of last Monday. So you can see it's very clear. It has some sport-specific requirements, and it shows the progression in terms of the timelines we're potentially looking at. So again, keep an eye out for what your sport puts together in this kind of space. In terms of going through considerations for return to play and training actions, we want to draw attention to both Sport Australia's elements of safe return to sport and their checklists. We're going to note here that a large majority of national and state sports organisations have adopted these elements and checklists and linked their member clubs and associations to these resources. So an example of this, Hockey New South Wales, earlier this year when they were looking for their return to sport, they made the checklists for individuals, clubs, associations and coaches mandatory. And they had more than 300 submissions from club level across the state that they worked through and had to formally tick off before the club itself could return to sport. We're going to deep dive into elements of this shortly, but broadly, Sport Australia's elements framework is designed as a roadmap through the return to sport for sports clubs, whether that's at a national, state or local level, and whether an association or a club. So firstly, under this, clubs and associations need to design and implement plans and processes to make sure that they're adhering to the specified government and health requirements. So this is to ensure that participants and volunteers are given an environment that is safe upon their return to sport. Secondly, clubs and associations must ensure that they've put in place proper hygiene practices at all facilities, including hand sanitising stations, clearly marked separate entry and exit points, attendance registers, and specifications on how equipment is to be used and shared if possible. The third step in the process is to ensure that the club or association has agreed on a process to deal with any potential outbreak within their midst. And this is because of obviously the rapid pace the illness can escalate. That clubs and associations must be able to quickly manoeuvre and respond, although this is going to be obviously easier if practices have been agreed beforehand and they can follow a simple action plan. So we saw that earlier this year with a lot of junior football clubs that were looking to get up to play and that they had the chance to actually train and potentially play at the time. There were a couple around that had some potential cases within their midst. One club in the region in particular at the time, there was a potential family case and it obviously was kind of big news because it made the media at the time and it was quite heavily publicised. But within that, the club itself had put in place the proper notification process. It was just a symptomatic case in the end and it wasn't a positive case, but the club itself was on the front foot. Proper people were notified and they followed the clearly agreed action plan that they put in place beforehand. Lastly, due to the impact this illness is going to have on sport for years to come, clubs and associations should ensure they ingrain protocols and policies for good health practices within their club culture. It should actually potentially become a way of life for the club for the foreseeable future where possible. So if you have a think about it, masks might be mandatory obviously for some time yet anyway, but does your club consider implementing other action plans? So are you looking as a club to potentially just follow what the minimum requirements are at government level, or are you looking as a club to potentially set an example and try and be a leader in terms of the proper hygiene practices that you've got in place as a club? A lot of these details are going to be covered in a COVID safe plan, so including mandatory response action and how you as a club will manage the hygiene and management of the return to sport protocols. But again, relying on your councils as one part and obviously your governing bodies as well in terms of what are the mandatory practices you have to implement and what are the optional ones you as a club may look to do to again, look to set an example. To go further into Sport Australia's elements of safe return to sport and their checklists, we have identified the following categories that we're going to work through. So firstly, the organisational level, second, approvals, third, returning to train, fourth, the facilities, fifth, hygiene, sixth, the management of the illness, and 7, employees and volunteers. Just before we go into each of these, we just want to say that there is a bit of information to digest through this, but there are a number of organisations that are here to help your club through the return to sport. So as we go through these, maybe have a think and feel free to share in the chat with Tim or Brooke. about some of the actions you've already done as a club and what are some takeaways you could look to potentially implement. Just before we go quickly into each of these items I've identified above, Brooke or Tim, is there anything to touch on through the chat at this stage?
Jessie, we just had a question from Paul around ID checking and is it mandatory at a sporting club? I've just responded that we'll follow up if it's mandatory, but clubs should have records of attendance for training and competitions and any club activities. I certainly know when junior sport came back for those couple of weeks, the sports had templates that you could print, you could download and print for every single session as a check-in. And, you know, to ask those questions, are you feeling okay? Is everyone at home feeling okay? That sort of thing. So Paul will follow up in terms of that mandatory, that word mandatory, but certainly it's a very, very good idea to have that. And I did hear in the press conference today about QR codes and yep. things like that. So I would make an assumption that that sort of stuff will come in, but I think Dan sort of alluded to the good old-fashioned pen and paper is just as good at this stage. So we'll get back to you on that one, Paul. Great question.
Thanks, Brooke. So we'll get into the items that we've identified before. So firstly, from a club perspective, some of the key areas to address for return to play and train planning are, firstly, ensuring your club or association is obviously going to be across all the relevant facts on COVID and specified return to sport requirements. This is obviously going to primarily be from the state government media releases and announcements, but as I've touched on, governing bodies are likely to quickly then outline specific requirements for respective sports. So your management as a club should be across both these sets of information. So government level, obviously, that is widely communicated, but then sport specific as well. Secondly, your club or association should make an agenda item at a meeting to clearly agree on who at the club will be responsible for making and implementing decisions on returning to sport. So this might stay with the committee generally, but it might also potentially be with a delegated authority if you've got that in place at your club. So maybe a CEO, potentially through the nomination of a COVID safety coordinator. The recommendation of a COVID safety coordinator is becoming more prevalent, and there are resources that have been developed to assist such coordinators at club level. Effectively, at the club level and in terms of governance, it just needs to be clear so everyone is across who is making the decisions, and there is a clear hierarchy in place at your club. Thirdly, and as touched on before, your club should agree on its COVID strategy ahead of time. So this ensures the club has a roadmap internally to work through the various stages rather than reactively having to make decisions. Due to the nature of the illness, as we've seen, this mightn't be possible for all scenarios. So a lot of winter clubs would have had detailed plans in place after the first lockdown, not expecting the second wave to come through. But regardless, it's going to be better to be ahead rather than being reactive as much as you can as a club. Fourth, because of the financial hit that the majority of clubs and organisations in sport have suffered, it's important to be across the costs that are going to be associated with the return to train and play. Some may affect members, obviously, and this has to be able to be communicated to them. And it's also worthwhile at this point in terms of financial to look at potential grants or opportunities to offset these costs. So a lot of clubs obviously would probably have taken a fair bit of a financial hit trying to get things off the ground in the first stage, but it is still a good look for members, and it was appreciated in the long run that they were actually trying to put in place those steps and putting resources towards getting back to sport. But still, at the end of the day, as a club, you have to be financially viable long term, and that's going to be your priority. Fifth, clubs or associations may need to obtain consents for return to play or train. And obviously this must be obtained or you potentially put your club at risk of exposure. So as part of this legal aspect, your club should have clearly agreed and communicated consequences of non-compliance for any requirements to its members. And it's also obviously important as part of this that they are aware of the potential impacts of breaches for the club itself. As part of this legal side of things as well, clubs can also look to potentially open up communication with their insurers on the strategies they've put in place to return to sport, just to make sure that you're not potentially breaching requirements of your insurance policies as well. Lastly, and it's been touched on a bit with the above, but clubs should have strong communication channels in place. So members shouldn't be in the dark where possible on where they stand. They should know who they can approach with inquiries, and they should have the confidence that their concerns are at least going to be heard and actioned if possible. Even if, as a club, that means you're just simply saying, we hear your concerns, but we're just not in a position to be able to respond at the moment due to the government restrictions. It is, as a club, at least acknowledging that they have made an inquiry and that you're doing it as much as you can to answer it. As I touched on the previous slide, various approvals are going to need to be obtained before you return to train and play, and this is going to come from different levels. So firstly, obviously, the government restrictions on activity, social distancing and competitive sport. Secondly, if your club, and this is an important one, if your club is using either a council or a privately owned facility, you're going to need to have to obtain their consent to use the facility in your proposed manner. You'll likely need to be able to document to the owner of the facility, whether that is council or it's privately owned, how it's actually going to be intended to be used and the health and hygiene practices you're going to implement as a club. So this might include your points of contact, entry and exit protocols, hygiene stations, and the distancing requirements as well once they're actually in the facility. And we touch on these a little bit later on in the presentation. Thirdly, your club's governing body. It might seem an obvious one, but a really, really important one from your internal club perspective. The governing body has to obviously give consent, and then also as a club or association committee, obviously you need to agree that as a club you're going to approve the return to sport. So just because the return to playing and training doesn't mean your club is actually going to be ready to do so. The committee needs to confirm this for you and have it actually documented that, yes, we as a club are committing, we're going to return to sport, we've got the plans in place, and this is our go-ahead plan basically as a club. So an important one that your actually club is ready to do it. Once your club has agreed on the roadmap and it has obtained the necessary approvals, it then needs to set into practice the return to training and play protocols. So obviously there's no doubt that this is going to look different to usual for participants, especially if they didn't have that period in the middle part of the year where they did get a chance to maybe come in and experience what this COVID normal sport period might look like. So maybe the last contact they've actually had with the club in terms of sport might have been pre-March when they would have had what they expected was normal training and playing. So it's potentially going to look different. And again, be across the sport-specific return to play requirements as a club. These are going to be fairly detailed around the numbers that can compete and participate, contact points, times, distancing, and the access to facilities. An important part as well when you're thinking about this is avoid, and this came up in the video, avoid unnecessary contact. So that message that came through, get in, train, get out. Obviously, using some of these examples at a national and international level that we've seen, so nationally with the AFL and NRL and Super Netball, obviously that finished up within the last couple of weeks, and then on an international level with the NBA, the NHL, they really put in place the practices to clearly identify what was unnecessary versus the necessary contact. So obviously within the AFL, contact's an essential part of the sport in terms of the tackling and the bumping, but the contact with the general public and with media members is unnecessary and wasn't an essential part to their sport. So thinking about that at a local level, think about what is necessary contact, and this is likely going to be dictated by your governing body in terms of your sport specific requirements, and what is obviously unnecessary as well. What can you as a club do to avoid those unnecessary contact points? Just another one to have a think about. Secondly, you will need to communicate these protocols in terms of the return to play and train actions to your members. So they shouldn't be left in any doubt as to what their obligations are when they actually arrive at your facility. They should also have the opportunity to ask questions in response to better their understanding as part of this. Just so, again, if you are sending out communications, that they've actually, again, got a contact point to come back to at the club that they can address any queries that they might have. Thirdly, there is training available on infection control for your staff and volunteers. So your governing body might actually require particular people within your club undertake this training. But again, it might actually just be best practice for those within your club that have contact with others, or those that are in positions of management or control to conduct such training. It might just be the COVID safety coordinator who needs to do it, but at least have the discussion as a club as to whether you're going to get the committee or a management group to do it, where it might be a club-wide approach, or again, it might be just for one individual that is having that contact point. If that's not mandated, have that discussion. An example of that, just within the local level, so the NAB League, which was obviously the junior talent program for under 18 footballers, they were looking to get up in the middle part of the season, and as part of the play plan, it was a mandatory requirement for all staff within the club that had contact point to actually undertake the training. There is government training available. It is a free process. It takes about 30 minutes and you get a certificate afterwards, but no staff member was able to return to training until they'd provided that certificate to the AFL. So again, something that was mandated from the governing body, but something that was then actioned at local club level.
Jessie, I've just popped that training link into the chat function, and certainly as AFL at a local level was coming back, my months are all over the place, but it was probably June, I believe. Yep. Certainly AFL Barwon asked that the people, coaches, team managers, that sort of thing, undertake that training, as well as an AFL protocols training as well. So I've just popped the link to that training in the chat function.
Excellent, thanks, Brooke. Lastly, on this slide, there is obviously also going to be really strict guidelines on the sharing of equipment. And obviously thinking about it, this is likely going to be one of the easiest ways to transmit the illness if it's still around. So making sure your members are aware of the equipment requirements relevant to your sport, and that your club can put in place sanitation protocols for unavoidable shared equipment. And again, your sport's probably going to outline what is the unavoidable shared equipment protocols versus what is the avoidable one. So being across that as well. We touched earlier on the approvals you'll need for your club's facilities, but there are particular actions you should put into place as a club. So firstly, there should be strict restrictions on who can attend the facilities and at what times they can attend the facilities. So this will include for user groups such as the participants, as well as staff members, coaches, referees and parents. There also should be clearly marked entry and exit points which are separate where possible. And the best way to manage these requirements are both obviously clearly communicating them to the members, whether that be prior to attending the facility or by signage at the facility, and ensuring you have someone from your club that's going to be present at the venue to ensure adherence when people arrive. So again, this might be your COVID safety coordinator. And using a local example of that, a basketball association opened up earlier this year for casual shooting when it was allowable. And within that, though, they had dedicated time slots that you had to book online for prior to. When you arrived, you had to list your details and your attendance. You had to go in a specific door that was for your court, and they had a dedicated staff member that was basically roaming the courts and making sure that there was distancing in place, and then the cleaning was then done after each time slot before the next group rolled in. So again, these are the kind of things that have a think about as a club as to what you can actually do as a club when you do get that ability to return to train and then play. Secondly, and as we touched on before in terms of the attendance record, having this in place for those who come into your facility. There are obviously some privacy laws with this, but the governing bodies and your sports will be across this and will outline what needs to be done. But this is obviously going to be a really useful way to be able to be across anyone who has had contact with your facility and this has been mandated at various levels. So your sport might have a template itself, but if not, Sport Australia has a really great template for this as well that you can use, and we'll provide the link to you as well that you can download. And it's a great one that, again, if your sport itself doesn't have one that's relevant for your sport, this is a good generic one that you can use as well. Once you've clearly identified the requirements for those attending your facilities, you need to, as a club, ensure you have proper hygiene protocols in place. So before even entering the facility, your members should be clearly aware that if they are showing any symptoms or they've had any potential contact with someone that may be infected, they should not attend the facility. This as a club at this stage should be a non-negotiable. It's going to be the quickest way to effectively put your club and its members at risk. and this obviously should be clearly communicated well prior to participation. Your club also might consider, or it might be dictated by governing bodies, to obtain medical clearances potentially prior to returning to train or play if someone has shown symptoms, or you might be required to complete a waiver prior to participation. So we saw that earlier this year, again, using basketball as an example, that there were a few school breakouts during the region earlier this year, and the basketball at that time, a lot of the associations basically followed the Department of Education guidelines as the contact points. And this obviously left a few kids frustrated in terms of maybe missing a game of basketball on a Tuesday night, but effectively it was making the decision not to put the club and its members at risk, even though there might have been a low possibility that it actually was going to be a COVID case or potential spread, but again, just absolutely minimising that risk as a club. Your club also should clearly communicate personal hygiene recommendations to its members. So this obviously includes things like washing your hands, wearing of masks, use of shared bathrooms, and the distancing requirements when they're at the stadium. There are resources that have been designed that you can download for this. Again, might be sport specific, if not government, Sport Australia, again, that you can use. And we've obviously seen it, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, that the signs that you can purchase and download to put up your local facilities, and council are obviously going to be fairly heavily involved depending on what council you're in, but they will be fairly heavily involved in terms of what signage is actually going to be up around their own facilities. Thirdly, once you have had stakeholders attend your facility and in between use, you should have proper cleaning protocols in place at regular intervals. This might even be between matches. So again, I'm using basketball example a few times, but they were one of the sports that had a brief period where they actually were able to return to play during the middle part of the period, middle part of the year, and had to actually put some of these practices into place. So at that time, they had used a central clock. So normally basketball is played across different sports with different scoreboards and timekeeping. But for this particular period, it was all on the one timekeeper. So all games finished at the one time. All participants and officials were required to vacate the premises in between matches. And this obviously allowed for staff members to conduct a proper clean before the commencement of the next matches happened, and people were allowed obviously back into facilities. Obviously, as part of this, ensuring your club has the supplies necessary to be able to regularly clean. And there are potential options to help with financial funding for this side of things. So keeping an eye out for government grants and other funding opportunities that might be able to help you with purchasing such equipment. Just in terms of some guidance on cleaning in particular, the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS, have a useful guide that we'll share in the link following the session as well. But effectively, in summary, surfaces need to be both cleaned and disinfected. So cleaning means wiping of dirt and germs off a surface, and DHHS have said that you can use common household detergent products for cleaning which are stocked at the supermarkets. And conversely, disinfection means using chemicals to kill germs on the surfaces. So again, DHHS have said that supermarkets, the supermarket stocking common household disinfection products is satisfactory, but it's important to use products that are labelled disinfectant and to follow the instructions on the label themselves. So just a few tips there on what DHHS is saying in terms of the cleaning protocols itself. Given the rapid spread of the illness that we've seen, and although we're clear in a regional sense at the moment, predominantly, but there is obviously going to be still the possibility of potential case at your club. We can't overrule that yet at this point. And because of this, you as a club need to be able to be ready and proactively and quickly respond to the situation. So firstly, making sure your club has agreed prior to recommencement, as I've touched on, for the actions it's going to take if a stakeholder presents with symptoms. If someone does present, your club will need to have an action plan for notifying the authorities of someone with symptoms. And lastly, within this, if someone has attended your facility and is symptomatic, you're going to need to be able to communicate to those who potentially had contact of this potential case. So obviously within this instance, and this might be mandated, this is where an attendance register is going to be really beneficial. So your club should be able to easily identify all those that have been to the facility at the same time as that symptomatic individual. The last one on this, but obviously potentially the most important, is considering the safety and welfare of your employees and volunteers. After all, through this period, they are the lifeblood of your club or your association, and they are going through a period of intense stress at the moment, and a lot has been asked of them through the period. So as a club, you need to be able to provide a safe working environment for your employees and volunteers. And this includes obviously the training opportunities and sessions so they can across the potential risks, the role they can play, and can ask any questions or raise concerns they have through this period as well. You might also, and this is an important one that we've seen previously as well, you might also be able to adjust rosters and have a volunteer pool so that effectively that you can change the contact points that volunteers are having with participants. And this reduces the chances of your employees and volunteers coming into contact with other individuals if you've got the ability to have that volunteer pool. So you're not relying on the same group of people to be at every session, that they're the ones that are going to be having the contact with the community at all times. You have the chance to actually have a few different people coming through the facilities. Lastly, your club or association might consider putting in place mental health and wellbeing support for its employees and volunteers, and making them aware of resources to assist them. So be proactive effectively as a club in communicating that their welfare is your priority above all else. So obviously we want to get everyone back to sport. It's such an important thing for people's lives to be back and involved in sport, but the welfare of the people within your club, so your little community as a club, is obviously going to be the priority above all else. After all this, and even after considering the elements that we've gone through, your club actually might still decide, and we've definitely seen this across different regions, that the risk to return to sport is actually still too great. So it might be from a financial perspective, obviously, or potentially purely an operational capability perspective as well. And there is nothing wrong with this. You're not, as I've said earlier, you need to be able to ensure that your club is viable going forwards, and the safety of its stakeholders is put first. And this must take priority over a quick return to sport that potentially might put your club at risk going forwards. Secondly, if your club or association does decide to return to sport, as I've said before, it must be prepared to manoeuvre quickly. As was learnt after the first wave and moving to the second wave, the situation can change really quickly. So your club should have contingencies in place to respond to different scenarios that might present. And as I said, you should ensure your club remains informed on potential developments that are coming up. Just before I touch on opportunities that we've seen coming out of this period that you might be able to adapt for your club, Brooke or Tim, anything that we've got coming up in the chat?
I've just shared a couple of another link just back to Vic Sport when you were talking about resources before, Jesse. So Vic Sport have got a really great page, a COVID-19 dedicated page that they have brought together links to Sport Australia, back to the state government, back to DHHS. So encourage everyone to jump on, if you haven't already, to have a look at the Vic Sport site. There's a question here from Kirby. In our opinion, if someone tests positive, should the entire club go into immediate 14-day isolation for all staff? I'm not an expert, and I'm not. It's probably not an opinion that I want to give. But again, that coming back to the record keeping, I think that's probably the most important thing to see. And the testers take control of the contacts and that sort of stuff. Then I would say again, I put in the notes up here, if everyone could put the COVID Safe app on their phone. So strong encouragement from sport, from the government, to get that app put on your phone. But then to follow the protocols from your peaks, and then DHHS would take over in terms of, if a positive test comes back, then who are the close contacts for that person. Obviously there'd be a deep clean of the facility if that person was using your facility, and I would say that the government takes over and the testers take over in terms of those close contacts for that person. So to say the entire club, no, I don't think so, but I'd be guided by the experts with that one.
Yeah, and I think on that as well, that, as you said, that's going to again come down to being able to actually identify the contact points as a club. If you can do so, then you're going to get the guidance, hopefully, that you can kind of limit it to the group that potentially had those contact points. If you haven't got the ability to definitively say who has had the contact points, it might be a bit more difficult, and that's where it might potentially be more widespread in terms of the potential isolation, maybe, but again, relying on the governing bodies, DHHS, that are going to tell that information.
Certainly, with a couple of examples we saw back sort of during the start of that second wave locally, when there was some cases that popped up at local clubland. Certainly the young people that were involved in the school where there was a positive case, they were asked not to attend training. And not to attend training, or their siblings or their close contacts to attend training if they were at the same club or any club in particular, until that contact tracing had been undertaken. So certainly there's some guidance that comes down then from either the school, the education department if it's a young person, or from the contact tracing team as to, isolation and that sort of thing.
Excellent. All right, moving into some opportunities that we've seen and that you can potentially implement at your club. Obviously, the current circumstances and even considering a return to sport for some has been a daunting period. There are definitely clubs out there who have demonstrated that there are opportunities, obviously, during the crisis itself and coming out of it when we do get back to that return to play period. Firstly, and I've got on this list, this period might present your club with an opportunity to look at different ways to engage its members. So this may ensure that although you can't have those physical contact points, you can maintain that connection and sense of competition. So an example I've got on the screen, Triathlon Victoria had recently held their club race series, which was an online competition where you effectively logged kilometres on your bike in your lounge room by video, and they counted towards a club's overall scores with prizes that were awarded at the end. Another example that we saw of a local soccer club down here in the Geelong region was using Strava, which has become a really popular app, obviously, to see if they could collectively run and ride their way around all the clubs in their region. And a local footy club as well, down on the Bellarine Peninsula way, they had a similar challenge and they collectively rode and ran their way around Australia as well. So some cool little initiatives that I'm sure a lot of you will look to put in as well, but again, some examples that you might be able to implement if not. Another one that we've seen as well, weekly raffles, and thinking outside the box in your current environment, obviously in terms of ways to engage. It's obviously not what you normally do, but the members are going to really appreciate the efforts to keep the community connected. And there are ways, as definitely we've seen as part of this, to keep sponsors engaged through these efforts as well. So I know we've got some members from South Barwon Footy Club in the room, but I really liked what they did recently in terms of, and I've seen it across the board with a few others as well, their sponsorship arrangement with the Barwon Hotel, and looking at, it wasn't just a simple promotion of both organisations, it was effectively trying to get people in the doors of the Barwon Hotel because that was going to put some funds back to the footy club as well. So looking at ways that you can maybe be a bit innovative with your sponsors, look at potential benefits going both ways, but again, keeping your members engaged and benefiting from it as well. Secondly, the time without sport has forced a lot of clubs to take a step back, obviously, and there is a positives in this. So use this as an opportunity to take stock as a club, plan and set the strategic direction for the club. So ask yourself the questions: where do you want your club to be in 12 months' time, 3 years, potentially even out as far as 5 years? What are the focus areas? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Taking the time to work through these types of questions so that when you can return to sport, you have a clear roadmap on where you're heading collectively. Thirdly, there are a number of grants available at the moment, whether it's from government level or other partners, councils as well. They're really looking for opportunities to assist sports clubs and associations to remain viable through this period. So as a club, looking for these opportunities. An example that we saw of this, we've done some work with a club to put in place a strategic plan that was a process that was funded, and flowing on from that, they'd identified that a focus area was to upgrade their facilities. So they then went as a second step and looked to look for funding to effectively to build that infrastructure, and they were successful through that because they'd gone through that initial process to put the strategic plan in place. And that was definitely favourably seen through that process. So looking for opportunities for that grant and funding. Just before we wrap up, we've got some time now. If there's any further questions, whether that's in the chat function or if you're happy to unmute yourself and maybe ask, open to you.
Hey, Jesse, just a quick one that's popped up in the chat function from Paul at Bowls Vic. Are you just able to go back over the COVID safety coordinator and maybe the training that's required as a part of that?
Yeah, definitely. It's one that I'll refer back to Sport Australia in terms of some of the requirements for that, and we'll make sure that we put in place some of the links that can give you some resources. But effectively, they're going to have the best in terms of templates for what they can do as a coordinator, and what are some of the requirements that you're looking for them to implement. So we'll put the links up to that and make sure we send them out with the slides.
A lot of the sports have been releasing some guidance on what they expect the COVID safety officers to undertake as part of the role as well. So whether that is the infection control training as well as some sport specific, whether it's something that's been developed by sport or to take on the Sport Australia training and guidelines. But I guess it's expected that the COVID safety officer does have a really good understanding of what your sport is allowed to do, and then some of the overlay that needs to happen. So whether it is, record keeping, making sure that there's hand sanitizer available when your participants turn up to training, that, you might be the one giving everyone a squirt if they're young people, regular hand sanitizing during the session if that's possible, really making sure that you've got a great understanding of zones if that needs to happen, and that zones can't cross over, that sort of thing. So certainly we'll put some information in the chat function, but I'd say your first protocol is to go back to your state or your national body to see what they've got, and then I did put in the chat function as well. I think it's a good idea to have a team of COVID safety officers, depending on the size of your club as well. The onus shouldn't fall on one person. It needs to be a shared position. You can work as a team to, alleviate any anxieties, to help understand what you can and can't do, or what you should and shouldn't be doing. And I guess it's just to try and create that level of safety for your members and opposition when they come into your facility as well. So we'll throw some more stuff in the chat function at the end of the session.
Any other questions, whether from the audience or from the chat?
Diane did have some questions around funding as well. So I've put a link back to the state government, to Sport and Rec Victoria grants. But certainly if you just follow Leisure Networks on Facebook, we try and grab hold of all the funding opportunities that we see and throw them up there, and also through our newsletter as well. But a good idea to follow the Sport and Rec page, the grants page, and also Vic Health are another really good one, and Vic Sport. So those three are the big ones that'll generally share, and then you've got your local sort of government and business opportunities as well.
Yeah, I just saw as well, just back to the previous discussion around the COVID safety, Paul's comment on that team concept. Obviously, it might fall back on the committee depending on the size of the club and depending on those that are willing to kind of put their hands up. But we have seen there has been, even if it's a small group of 2 or 3 potentially that are outside the committee that are effectively putting their hand up as a quasi subcommittee, effectively, that are just saying, look, leave the committee to focus on the running of the club. We as a small group are then going to focus purely on the return to sport through the COVID side of things, and that the health and safety. That has been a really popular model, and it is a really great model to have those distinct focus areas between the operational side at the committee and focusing on the COVID side as that smaller group, if possible. Any other comments or questions before we finish up? Just got a couple of minutes, so we'll look to finish on time. All right, just before I hand back to Brooke, just a couple of things to finish on. And again, we're going to share these in the chat and through follow-up email with the slides after the session. But There are a number of useful resources for operating during the COVID restrictions. So as I've said on a number of occasions, Sport Australia, the benefit with Sport Australia is that the resources aren't sport specific. So you can adapt a lot of the protocols that are in place. But beyond that as well, and it's definitely something we've seen through this latest period, so the second wave, the governing bodies themselves have been really proactive in actually really trying to get that sport-specific stuff out as well. That mightn't have been the case the first time around, definitely the case the second time around. So been across that. Club Help is our website, and again, we've got a lot of useful guides up there, and it's not just specific to COVID. It's got a lot of other information and templates that you're more than welcome to use, to adapt for your club, and go from there with that. And as Brooke touched on before, Sport and Recreation Victoria, their page, that's going to be the latest source of all the news that is coming out, and the information as it comes basically straight from Dan Andrews' mouth. It's going straight up on those websites. So again, that's where you're going to get your latest news. So I'll pass back to you, Brooke, to finish off.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Just a huge thanks to everyone for jumping online tonight. You guys are the lifeblood of community sport, and we're certainly here to help in whatever way, shape, or form we can. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you've got any further queries around tonight's presentation or anything else related to your club, for that matter. A reminder that we've got another 3 sessions. This is a 4-part series. So Melbourne Cup next Monday, we thought we'd give that one a miss. And then so the following session is the 9th of November. All the bookings are on the same link that you would have used on Try Bookings to sign up. So yeah, we'd love to have you back for the next 3 sessions. Feel free to provide us any comments, any follow-up. We learn from these things. Obviously, we'd much rather be in person, but you know, these are a great way to get some information out in a really timely manner virtually. So we look forward to seeing you again shortly. Have a great night, everyone, and thanks again for your attendance.